All right, welcome back everyone to the Planetarium Online program from Liberty Science Center. I'm Mike, the Planetarium Director, and we're going to be doing our program here on astrology and astronomy. So normally we do our shows in the giant dome, the 90-foot dome at Liberty Science Center. We are, which is breaking news, going to be reopening over Labor Day weekend. The planetarium will be open during opening weekend. Once we go into Labor Day weekend, we're going to be open on Thursdays through Sundays. The first day, the Friday, the 4th of September, will be for members only, and then the rest of the weekend will be open for the general public, doing shows every hour in our big dome. So while we were closed, the folks that did our planetarium software, which is called Digistar, were kind enough to allow us to use the software to do online programming that goes right to your house or to your community center or place of work. So we're going to be doing our programming today largely using Digistar. A few other odds and ends, and so we have Caroline in the chat, so she's here to help answer your questions. She's one of our STEM team members. Andrew, who's the other planetarium staff, is getting a well-deserved break in the Smoky Mountains this week. He'll be back next week for science fiction and science fact. Also, we are carrying the torch and really trying to keep astronomy and STEM education going in New Jersey and nationwide. And so if you wanted to support us, that little round kind of bottle top image that says donate is the way to donate to us. Thank you for your support as we take it to the next level, evolving into the reopening of our institution in just a couple of weeks. We'll leave some time at the end of the show also to address your questions. So all astronomy begins with the nighttime sky. We're going to talk about the nighttime sky a bit to begin the show. So we're going to be heading out here on a beautiful night. We're going to actually be beginning with the October skies here. And so as we're looking out towards the skies here, I mean, it's certainly under a beautiful night sky like this. As we said in the Alien show 2 weeks ago, it's easy to begin to feel your mind wandering as you see the Milky Way and all the thousands of stars in the dark night. It's easy to wonder, is there life out there? And it's easy to wonder, is there some way that we, humans, have a connection to the cosmos? And so astrology expresses, I think, a very deep human desire to feel connected with the greater universe out there. It expresses this desire to feel that we are part of the greater universe. And so astrology and astronomy are kind of grew up together. Astrology, the human connection to the cosmos. Astronomy, the scientific study of the nature of the universe. Now, astrology goes all the way back over 3,000 years ago. So we can trace the origins of astrology back to this place. Now, I know it doesn't look like much right now, but these are the ruins of the fabled city of Babylon in what is now Iraq. And Babylon was where we believe astrology really got its roots and began to evolve over 3,000 years ago. So it was a very different city back in those days. We have the famous Hanging Gardens in the foreground, and even more famous in the background, we have the Tower of Babel. So astrologers working here in Babylon 3,000 years ago began to develop a lot of these ideas that turned into our modern views of astrology. And again, astronomy, the study of the sky, astrology, the impact of the sky on us, kind of evolved side by side. Well, this wisdom was originally there in the Middle East, but Alexander the Great came along in the 4th century BC, and his conquering and all helped to spread a lot of cultural elements back to other parts of his land that he conquered. And astrology was spread to Egypt, to Alexandria, where the big astrologer of the early centuries, Ptolemy, in Alexandria, Egypt, really developed astrology and codified it in a book. So Ptolemy, 2nd century AD. Notice here he's holding a globe. Folks pretty much did believe the world was round and a sphere, even back in the days of Ptolemy. Ptolemy is a great codifier of the idea that the Earth was the center of the entire universe and everything went around the Earth. He was also very into geography and wrote one of the first big books about geography. and he was an astrologer, and his book called The Four Books, or Tetrabiblos, was the statement of how to do astrology that was passed on and really developed into the astrology that we know today. So that's a bit about the origins. Now we're going back to that October sky that you would see about 2:30 in the morning. And here we are in the skies that you'd see early in the morning. Beautiful October sky, maybe fantasizing about nice, crisp October weather here in the heat of August. Orion the Hunter with his belt and his shoulders and his kneecaps already there in the morning sky, the beautiful Milky Way going across the sky. So to understand astrology, you have to understand three basic motions that our planet Earth goes through. And the most basic one is called daily motion. So let's observe that first. We're just going to let time take its course, and as the world turns, we'll see that stars rise in the east and set in the west, very much like, say, the sun does during the day. And as we go through the turning of the Earth here in October, we have the constellation of Leo the Lion rising, as it does every October. So here, Leo the Lion, one of the 12 signs of the zodiac. You'll hear a lot more about zodiac signs as our show goes on. And actually embedded in its pause this October only, you have the beautiful blazing light of the planet Venus. Venus is in our morning sky now. Here in August, it's going to be with us for months as a brilliant beacon in the morning sky. So it's not always expressed often in modern sort of newspaper horoscopes, but in traditional astrology, the constellation of the zodiac and any planets that were rising when you were born or whenever a great event was planned were really, really important. So to cast your full horoscope, you had to know what constellation was rising at the moment you were born. So if you're making plans to basically be born on October 1, 2020, if that's your idea of your plans ahead, it might be a good idea to get born at that time because you have Leo the Lion with the benign, brilliant light of the planet Venus shining in it. Venus considered generally a very good sign among the planets. Planets play a big role in astrology. We'll talk about that later as well. So takes about 2 hours on average for a zodiac sign to rise. And that idea of the rising constellation when you are planning an event or when a birth is happening was really important. It's one reason why Ptolemy was a geographer as well. Stars rise at different times in different parts of the Earth at different latitudes. So you had to know geography well also to do the art of astrology. So just to note as well, I mentioned already, there's Orion the Hunter here in the early morning skies on October 1, and here is the famous Big Dipper. The Big Dipper is here pointing faithfully to the North Star. So with daily motion, as the world turns, we know it's now the world turning, not the sky turning around us, that North Star stays in place, and all of the rest of the sky seems to move across the sky, rising in the east and then setting in the west. So from outer space, we know now, as Ptolemy did not, that it's the world that turns that creates this illusion. North Star over the North Pole faithfully stays in place, and everything else spins around it. So this is daily motion, and that, again, is the most basic of all of the motions that the Earth goes through. So we're going to daily motion it through this day on October 1, from sunrise to sunset. So Venus rises in the sky. We're still on daylight saving time in October, and even into November. And so sun rises around 7 and heads towards the western sky. And we'll be now going into the evening sky for that same day. We're still staying on October 1 for reasons that will be made apparent momentarily. And we're going to watch as the sun goes down. Keep your eyes peeled for what stars appear above the sun as we go into the evening here on October 1. So if you scan the sky, so the sun went down here in the west, there's very, very faint, the faintest, or at least not the faintest, but the smallest of the 12 signs of the zodiac is right above where the sun went down. And this little tiny square is called Libra, the scales. It's the only inanimate object among the 12 signs of the zodiac, and one of the hardest ones to make out. Hard to make a set of scales out of that, but that is Libra. And it is the only inanimate object in the 12 signs of the zodiac. So everything else is either an animal or a human or some combination of both, like Capricorn, the sea goat, for example, or like the centaur. By the way, Libra is Latin for pound. If you've ever wondered why we abbreviate pound LB in English, it's because of that. LB means pound in Latin. So far more striking and dramatic than Libra the scales is the constellation of the Scorpion. Next to Libra, there's the Claw, the star Antares, and the Stinger. So that one is a very easy one to find. It has more bright second magnitude stars than any other of the signs of the zodiac. You see it here as a J-like shape. Over in Hawaii, we called it Maui's fishhook, as you may know that term from the Moana movie. And in Greco-Roman mythology, it was the Scorpion that killed Orion. They became constellations, but neither of them will share the sky together. You'll never see Orion as long as the Scorpion is in the sky. So now behind the Scorpion, or called Scorpio in astrology, that's an odd little thing, that Scorpio in astrology, Scorpius, the same constellation in astronomy. There's another constellation of the zodiac called Sagittarius. But there are 8 stars in Sagittarius that are really, really bright, and a bunch of them that are really hard to see. So it may be better to take the bright stars and draw them as the teapot, their nicknames. So there's the handle, the top, and the spout of a teapot. And those stars in Sagittarius are ones that stand out quite nicely. So you may think of it as punishment for Scorpius killing Orion, that the teapot is now pouring hot tea on his tail. And you can imagine again imagine the Milky Way here being the steam coming from that. Now, of course, the Greeks, as far as I know, didn't have tea. They didn't see a teapot there. They saw it as Sagittarius, the archer, half man, half horse. But either way, poor Scorpius gets it. Now the centaur is aiming an arrow at the heart of Scorpius to punish him for killing Orion. So there are 3 zodiac signs lined up there in the evening sky, in the early October evening sky. Now what I want to do, so this is October 1. I want to go forward 1 full month to November 1. Also go out at sunset and do the same observation of the sky and try to find these same constellations again. So now we're going to just do a leap forward to the 1st of November, All Saints' Day, the day after Halloween. And we're going to try to find these same constellations in the sky 1 month later. So again, we'll start in the later afternoon and then head to sunset. Sun goes down. We'll again go to about an hour and a half after sunset. So let's take a moment, looking again towards where the sun went down, and try to find those same constellations we saw. Try to find Libra. Try to find the Scorpion. Try to find the heavenly teapot. So they seem, at least 2 of them seem to be missing. There is no Libra, which is hard enough to find under normal circumstances. But now the Scorpion is also gone. But if you try to find the teapot is still there. There is the handle and the top and the spout. So the teapot is still there, but the sun has moved in front of the stars of the Scorpion. We can't see it because it's up when the sun is up. And as it gets dark, the constellation of the Scorpion sets with the sun and therefore is not visible in the evening sky. So we still have Sagittarius still in November 1, and he's still aiming his arrow, but he's aiming his arrow now at a Scorpius that is below the horizon where the sun is. So that's the thing about constellation zodiac signs that confused the heck out of me when I was just getting started. The zodiac sign is a constellation that's behind the sun at a certain time during the year. So the month of Gemini, for example, you can't see the constellation of Gemini because it's behind the sun. It's the constellation you can't see, the zodiac sign you can't see, that's the one that applies to that given month. But thousands of years ago, folks were wise enough, even back then, to figure out which constellation was behind the sun. Again, it was the one they couldn't see. And they developed this zodiac, developed in Babylonia and enhanced by the Greeks and the Romans, that is still our standard list of the zodiac signs now. So we've seen 3 already. So we've seen this, Libra, the scales, and Scorpius, the scorpion, and Sagittarius, the centaur. And we'll look at the other ones as well, because people like to see where their zodiac signs are. These, again, are stars that are behind the sun at different points during the year. And to be a zodiac constellation, you don't have to be bright. You just have to be behind the sun during part of the year. So a good example of that, for example, here we have the constellation of Capricorn. Very faint, and looks to me more like a smile of, say, the Joker in the Batman movies. And he is kind of a joker. It's the great god Pan, a trickster god, who transformed himself to a half-goat, half-sea creature. So there we have Capricorn. Capricorn, not as bright as Sagittarius next to it, but it is blazingly bright compared to our next sign of the zodiac. So next is Aquarius. Let me turn on a very dim line drawing for Aquarius. So Aquarius, the stars are really faint, around fourth magnitude. It's supposed to be a man holding a jar of water and pouring it out. Almost every depiction you see of Aquarius, he's got this jar on his shoulder and he's pouring the water out. So here is the water jar. That's the actual name of this little cluster of stars. The man is here. He's got a line for his body. But then here are the 2 jets of water, including little semicircles that are the splashes of the water. So that is Aquarius, a really faint constellation, but maybe you can see it as a water jar with water flowing out from it. The next constellation over, Pisces, also pretty dim. 2 fish, for some reason, tied together by a ribbon. And then beyond Pisces, we have Aries, the ram. So here's a zodiac thing you may not know, is that every zodiac, on any given evening, if you have a flat horizon and a dark sky, you can see 6 zodiac signs all the time. Any given point of the night, 6 zodiac signs are above the horizon, 6 zodiac signs are below the horizon. And these all mark the path of the sun. So as the year goes on, the sun moves in front of these stars, and as it does so, each month is assigned to one or another of these zodiac signs. Now here's the sky on November 1, so I just wanted to mention one thing. 2001, last time we had a full moon on Halloween. This year we will again. The moon will still be full here on November 1, the day after Halloween. So it'll be a mini full moon. You've heard of supermoons probably, when the moon is a little bigger than normal when it's full. This will be the smallest full moon, but still be a really great sight to have for Halloween. So we'll let the night go on to show you the other signs of the zodiac as we go through the night here in November. Taurus, the bull, one of the largest and most striking of the signs of the zodiac. The Gemini twins, also a very bright constellation. Much fainter, Cancer the crab. Leo the lion, which we saw in our first observation there on October 1. And then finally, just rising, we have part of Virgo the maiden coming up just before the first light of day. So those are the 12 signs of the zodiac as codified about around 3,000 years ago, beginning the year with Aries on March 21 and then going through the year. So one question you may have, I had certainly when I was learning this stuff, is why doesn't the set of zodiac signs line up to the months of the year? Well, for many cultures, the year began on the first day of spring, March 21. And that was a really, really important time for many, many cultures. Beginning of the farming season, ending of the bad weather of winter. So many calendars began on the first day of spring. And to this day, the zodiacal year begins on March 21 with the sun allegedly in Aries, the ram, because of that. So the apparent path of the sun, called the ecliptic, that is the path that it follows. Of course, we know instead now that it's not the Earth going around the sun as Ptolemy believed and others. We know now that it's the sun in the center and the Earth going around it. So we can show that same thing we were showing a moment ago. So there's the sun, there's the Earth, and here is a constellation of Sagittarius. And so from our perspective, as the Earth orbits the sun, the sun appears for about a month or so to be in front of the stars of Sagittarius, the Centaur. And then as we move along, it then appears to be in front of Capricornus, the Sea Goat, and then it appears to be in front of the stars of Aquarius, and so on through the year. So in olden times, when they framed the zodiac, they thought that the sun was going around us. But now we know that it's actually us orbiting the sun. But the same effect, basically, we see the sun appear to move, so it's called the apparent motion of the sun against the signs of the zodiac. So that's the second of the three big motions we're talking about. So daily motion, the Earth spins on its axis, and it gives us day and night. Second motion is we go around the sun every 365 and a quarter days, and that gives us the year. The third motion we'll leave for the end of our program. So that is a bit about that, and the wheel of the zodiac, framed nearly 3,000 years ago, is one that we still refer to all the time in astrology, and it begins with the first day of spring and then goes through the year that way. Now, it's basically it was Arabic astronomers who carried on the knowledge of Ptolemy in what was called the Dark Ages, and then that was passed on back to Europe and helped to fuel the Renaissance, this great rediscovery of art and music and science and culture. And astrology had its heyday in the Renaissance as well, as it also became part of everyday life. Now, I love doing this at every show because it allows us to fly out and show you where we are and where we are compared to Manhattan. And so as we're looking at the Liberty State Park, this circle here is the dome of Liberty Science Center's Jennifer Chalsty Planetarium, about 90 feet in diameter. It was an IMAX dome theater until 3 years ago when we renovated it to be the biggest planetarium in America. And then here we have the rest of Liberty Science Center. There's our parking lot, and here is the enormous Liberty State Park, which our center is located in. As we pull back, you'll get a better sense of where exactly we are geographically, as Manhattan will be coming into view. So take a moment here. If you go back and try to find Liberty Science Center now, it could be a challenge. Try to find it where I pointed it out. Take a moment, try to find our Science Center and Planetarium. It is right there. Here we have the Statue of Liberty is there. Ellis Island with its great immigration museum is there. And here is fabulous Manhattan. You can see Central Park there. So when things do lighten up in terms of travel, it is a very short hop from Manhattan on the path over to Liberty Science Center. So it'd be great if someday you can come and see us in our real dome. And our team that does these online programs is the same team that does the shows there. So you will actually see me and Andrew and others on our staff doing programming there in the dome beginning on Labor Day weekend. Okay, so we're going to Europe for a moment because we can, and I love doing this to show the geographical location of New Jersey to Europe. But places like Italy wound up really getting invested in believing in astrology. In all of Europe, basically, you couldn't do anything in your life if you were in the 15th or 16th century in Europe without consulting astrologers. So if you were basically learning how to be a doctor in Bologna, Italy, in the 15th century, you had to study 4 years of astrology to make sure your operation was going to be done when the signs were right. It was just as much a part of what you did as learning how to minister to a fever. So the lower classes would go to stalls, for example, on the old bridge in Florence here, and consult a stall astronomer or go to an office. But the upper classes had their own astrologers. And so Catherine de' Medici from Florence went to France, married the King of France. She had her own astrologer, a guy you may have heard of, Nostradamus. And she wouldn't do anything without consulting astrology. And Elizabeth over in England, Elizabeth I, Queen of England, also had John Dee, her astrologer. Now, Elizabeth also patronized William Shakespeare, and he's a really good example in his works of how astrology permeated life in the Renaissance. You couldn't do anything. You couldn't speak 5 lines of dialogue without referring to astrology. And there's at least 100 allusions to astrology in the works of Shakespeare. Good example is King Lear, which is sort of a control test for astrology, you might say. So King Lear's got 3 daughters. Regan, Goneril, and Cordelia. Two of the daughters are unbelievably, murderously evil. They're terrible daughters, and they're really bad to each other as well. Cordelia, the good daughter, is so loyal and faithful that her loyalty to King Lear leads to her death. Spoiler alert. And so there's a comment by Kent, who's sort of the conscience of King Lear, one of the characters, says, yeah, astrology must be true, because here you have three daughters of the same mother, the same father, raised in the same location, and yet two are totally evil, and one is unimaginably good. It must be the stars at the different times they were born that caused them to be this way. Now, sometimes Shakespeare says things that seem to be anti-astrology. A famous quote is that Cassius, one of the assassins of Julius Caesar, says that the false Brutus are not in the stars, but in ourselves, as if he's saying, we blame astrology for our bad behavior, but really we're masters of our own fate. Now, compromising that fact is that several characters who kind of diss astrology in Shakespeare are evil characters as well. So we don't really know how Shakespeare came down, whether he believed in it or not, but poetically he definitely referred to it constantly, and it certainly fit into this unified view of the cosmos, of an Earth in the center surrounded by the stars and planets that fit very nicely into the great arc of the universe as understood in the Renaissance. So an important point on the same topic is that basically every astronomer, like Galileo and Kepler of the Renaissance, also did astrology. That was the paying gig you could get, was to predict the future and do horoscopes. And so when along comes Galileo after doing astrology as kind of a side gig and presents this new thing called a telescope that is supposed to amplify the size of Jupiter to the point where you can see the moons of Jupiter. A lot of folks thought it was just another magic trick when the telescope came along, like an alchemist trying to say that he can turn lead into gold. So side by side here in the late Renaissance, you had astronomers like Galileo trying a new way of doing science by observation and testing and experimentation. But at the time, it seemed all of the same piece as the magical natural sciences of alchemy and astrology and so forth. Kepler, even more so, who was about the same time as Galileo in Northern Europe, was really trying to figure out the motion of the planets to do better horoscope predictions because the planets were really big in astrology. And his work on that led to his laws of motion and led to us finally understanding how the planets really move and how to predict their motions. So planets really are the devil in the system. So the sun and to a large extent the moon move in very predictable ways. But the planets are harder to get at and to understand. And if your job as an astrologer is to predict where the planets are going to be, you better be good at it. But the planets were really hard in terms of working out a model that would tell you exactly where they're going to be at any future date. So here we are, going back to March 1 of this year. 3 planets in the sky blazing away. Mars, named for March. Jupiter and Saturn, or I should say that the month of March is named for Mars. So planets are close enough to us. You can see them move against a starry background if you do a little time lapse. So let's go through the tumultuous month of March 2020. The planet Mars catching up with Jupiter. All of the planets, by the way, also move against the background of the zodiac, as does the moon. And as we get to March 19, here you have a conjunction of Jupiter and Mars. So you hear about conjunctions in astrology. 2 planets that appear to be together in the sky. Jupiter overall being seen as a very benign influence next to Mars, which is seen as being more of a evil influence quite often. So maybe the evilness of Mars overpowered the good nature of Jupiter, because if you remember, mid-March 2020 is when everything began to really kick in terms of our current crisis. So moving on here, so being nearer to the sun, the planet Mars moves very quickly, and this little speed demon then catches up with the planet Saturn. So there is Mars and there is Saturn, and so they were in conjunction at the very end of March. So here you have these two quite baleful planets, Saturn and Mars, the two like really bad signs joined together. So who knows? Coincidence? Probably, but it's interesting to see that these two most baleful of the planets were gathered together there in the sky during the very first month of of the high times that we had back in the spring. So planets were really, really important. They were like perfect for astrology because you had the background of the fixed zodiac signs, and then you had all of these moving objects in different combinations that could be used as ways to try to foretell the future. And so planets also, every planet was assigned a couple of signs of the zodiac as well. So in this view here from Cardiff in Wales, here is the planet Venus. It says Venus right there. And she was associated with Libra the scales. If you look really closely here, you can maybe see the scales here on her blouse, and with Taurus the bull. She has Taurus at her feet. So when a planet was in one of its two special constellations, that also could mean that whatever influence there was doubled or tripled. The planet Jupiter was associated with Pisces. So here is Jove, Jupiter, with Pisces, and with Sagittarius. There is the bow of the archer. And then Saturn, the planet, was connected with the constellations of Capricornus, the sea goat, and there's our water bearer again. So there he is holding that jar, pouring the water onto the surface. So the planets had a lot of influence. Their gatherings, their positions against the background of stars, signs of the zodiac, had a big influence in how the view of astrology was mapped out. Now, one more thing you probably hear about a lot is retrograde. And so that's something I wanted to talk about too, because especially the idea of a planet going retrograde is generally considered an evil omen as well. So here we are, we're looking at the planet Mars. We're now actually looking at the sky. You'd see if those clouds would go away this very evening. So just after midnight, there's the blazing planet Mars. This is really what you would see around midnight, August 13, the sky tonight. Mars is getting really bright right now. And if you were to monitor Mars over the next couple of months, day by day, follow its motion, it would all of a sudden, as we get into, there goes the moon, a little speed demon, September, it would seem to stop and go backwards. And when a planet stops and appears to go backwards, that is called retrograde. That's what retrograde means. A planet seeming to go backwards from its normal motion across the sky. And then by November, it'll go ahead and resume its regular motion. So this is actually one thing also that led folks to really think that the Ptolemaic system with the Earth at the center was just not workable. It was really, really hard to explain planetary backward motion if you believe that the Earth was at the center and all the planets were going around the Earth. However, if you imagine that the Earth is orbiting the sun with the other planets, then retrograde motion becomes completely logical and indeed inevitable. So as Earth overtakes Mars, Mars appears to stop from our perspective and go backwards in what's called retrograde motion before resuming forward motion. And that was something that really sold the likes of Copernicus and the fact that you basically had to have the Earth orbiting the sun instead of the old Ptolemaic way of doing things. So the idea of retrograde, you hear it actually most often in terms of the planet Mercury going retrograde. And so, for example, as the messenger god, the god of communication, Mercury retrograde often means watch out for problems in communication with others. But that, again, is a term, retrograde, that gets addressed quite a bit. So that is, again, the planet, the backwards motion, an important point of all of this. Now, another thing, so we've talked about the two motions so far. But the third motion, basically, we also need to address in terms of astrology and astronomy. So basically, we talked about the Earth spinning on its axis once a day, giving us daily motion. And then the Earth goes around the sun every 365.25 days. And that gives us the year. And so here we are going, as we go around the sun, because the Earth is tilted, we have certain times in the northern hemisphere where we're tilted away from the sun, causing winter. and certain times when we're tilted in, causing summer, and 2 times during the year, the first days of spring and fall, where neither pole is tilted in towards the sun and neither pole is tilted away from the sun. And so on the first day of spring, that all-important day, the beginning of the year, we have the northern hemisphere not tilted in, not tilted out. And so when they created the zodiac 2,500 or so years ago, the first day of spring, when again neither hemisphere is tilted in or out from the sun, occurred with the sun in front of the constellation of Aries the Ram. And because the zodiac was defined here 25 or so 100 years ago, we still use this today. So we still begin the zodiac year with Aries the Ram, because that was the constellation behind the sun on March 21, the first day of spring back in those olden times. So one more motion, though, of the Earth that we have to account for, besides the daily motion and the annual motion, is that the Earth also wobbles like a top, taking about 26,000 years to do one complete wobble. So let's go ahead and look at that wobble. The wobble is called precession, or often called precession of the equinox. And as it wobbles, it affects what stars appear behind the sun at different times. This whole wobble takes about 26,000 years, but because it's been over 2,500 years since they named the zodiac, we've gone through about 1/10 of a complete wobble so far. So on the first day of spring in 400 or so BC, we had the sun in front of Aries, but thanks to that wobble, that 1/10 of a full wobble we've gone through since then, the sun now on the first day of spring is in front of the stars of Pisces the fish. So that on this day now, when the tilt of the Earth doesn't matter, when neither hemisphere is tilted in or out from the sun, on that first day of spring now, and ever since really about 68 BC, the sun is in front of the constellation of Pisces the fish, where it will be for a few hundred more years. That wobble will continue for a few hundred more years, and in the 26th century, the first day of spring will occur when the sun is in front of the stars of Aquarius. So if you're ever wondering where that line came from, this is the dawning of the age of Aquarius. It's kind of a long dawn, but in 500 years, the first day of spring, that really important day, will occur with the sun in front of Aquarius instead of in Pisces, where it is currently. The folks who composed here were very much influenced by ideas of astrology. One more little byproduct, by the way, of that wobble. I said earlier that you can't see your zodiac sign during your birthday because the sun is right in front of your zodiac sign. But actually, this is now November 22nd. Because of that wobble, it is actually possible in the first couple of days of a zodiac month to see that constellation. So we're going to look at Sagittarius again to wrap up. So Sagittarius begins on the 22nd of November. And so here's the sky you'd see on November 22nd. And the constellation of Sagittarius actually now, for the first couple of days of its month, November 22nd, November 23rd, probably November 24th, you can still see it in the sky, even though you're now officially in the zodiac month for Sagittarius. So Sagittarius becomes visible. This neat little trick only works for the first few days of the zodiac month, however. So if your birthday is November 23rd, you're a Sagittarius, you can go out and see Sagittarius on the night of your birthday. I'm a Gemini. Gemini begins on the 21st of May. May 23rd is my birthday. I can see Gemini in the sky on that day. Later in the month, it'll have your constellation will have set. But that's a little side benefit of this wobble of the Earth that has put things off about one constellation of where they used to be. So that is our overview of that. It's an interesting way that astronomy and astrology help to drive discoveries, and it's something that still expresses this interesting desire to feel connected to the cosmos. With that, we're going to wrap up the formal part of our show. The show will be available. All of our shows are available at LSC in the House, which is our Facebook, where we put all of our Facebook programming. So if you wanted to view this later, all the shows we've done, all 20 of them, things like the Black Hole Show, the Galaxy Show. They're all there on our LSC in the House page. Again, if you would like to donate to Liberty Science Center, we're trying to keep the flame alive of astronomy education, and that little donate button is a way to do that. That'll end our formal program. We will take a few moments to address your questions before we come to the end of our program. So yeah, wobble is new to me. So that was the trickiest thing I ever had to figure out, as Christina is mentioning, is that wobble and how it affects the seasons. So basically, we have the same seasons we've always had, but because of the wobble, the constellations behind the sun during different seasons do change very slowly. Yeah, Mercury and Cupid have a lot in common, is what Loretta is saying. So Mercury, the messenger god, the winged god. Mercury is the fastest moving planet in the sky. And because of that, I think it was maybe that was why it was identified with the messenger god. And he had wings on his heels, much as Cupid is often depicted as having wings on his back. Yeah, so Will's commenting that Kepler actually invented and discovered many things considered standard astrology today. So Kepler really lived in both worlds and had many interesting ideas of how the universe worked. But it was truly his devil was trying to predict the planet Mars. That was what really fascinated Johannes Kepler. He couldn't find a way to predict, even going with the heliocentric theory, why it was that Mars seemed to change, speed up, and slow down. Well, at that time that Kepler was doing his work, even though people like Galileo believed that the sun was in the center, the power of Aristotle was so great that everyone still believed that planets had to orbit in perfect circles around the sun. And it was only when, in frustration, Kepler tried instead to imagine what it would be like if a planet went around not as a circle but as an oval. At that point, he realized that was the solution, and that was the way that he was able to figure out exact planetary motion, and also to then become a better astrologer by predicting certain basic things about where planets were going to be. So someone also mentioned there are 13 zodiac constellations. Yeah, great comment there. Because of this wobble, there is a constellation, a giant one, that is above the Scorpion called Ophiuchus, the serpent bearer. And now, in 2020, the sun does enter into the constellation of Ophiuchus now, the serpent bearer, for a number of days of the year. So you're right that technically 12 signs of a zodiac, when it was framed thousands of years ago, nowadays there are 13 constellations that are behind the sun, including it lingering in front of the constellation of Ophiuchus, the serpent bearer, for a little bit of time. Checking out more of your comments here. Thank you for your donations, folks. We do appreciate that. So the wobble of the Earth. So that's a great question. Why does the wobble take so long? Part of the wobble is just the tug of our moon. So not every planet wobbles like the Earth does, but our moon's tug helps to cause this wobble, which currently does a very slow wobble for just under 26,000 years. So who knows how different our planet would be if we didn't happen to have a moon to affect these different elements of life here on Earth. So so because of the wobble motions, basically you'll be off one zodiac sign every 2,000 years, right? So nowadays, when they founded the zodiac almost 3,000 years ago, the first day of spring the sun was in Aries. It's wobbled over now, so the first day of spring, the sun is now in Pisces, and in the 26th century, the sun will be in front of Aquarius, so which I really find amazing that it's so far away till the sun is in Aquarius on the first day of spring, but they still thought that would be an interesting idea for a song, The Dawning of the Age of Aquarius, which then gave its name to an entire generation in the 60s. Amuth is wondering, does every star have a name? So all of the stars that are bright have their own names. Many of the names of stars are actually in Arabic. As I was mentioning with astrology, it also applies to astronomy. In the so-called Dark Ages, scholars in the Middle East, in Arabia and such, carried on and preserved a lot of the astronomical and astrological information from the Greeks and the Romans, the Egyptians. And so a lot of names that we use now for stars are Arabic, like Aldebaran, for example, or the most famous example is Betelgeuse or Betelgeuse, which may, although there's a lot of debate, mean armpit or shoulder of the great giant. Although that's actually quite debatable. But a lot of this really does come from there. But there's also there's one star, Canopus, the second brightest star. Bad news is you can't see it from here. It never rises above the New Jersey horizon. But that's actually named for a character, for a Greek character who was the steersman on the Argo as Jason went off to find the Golden Fleece. Some names come from Greek. So Sirius, the dog star, the brightest star, comes from a Greek word that means scorching. When I lived in Hawaii, that same star, by the way, is called A'a, A-A, A'a with a glottal stop. And it means the same thing, basically. It's a Hawaiian word for fire. So Parul is wondering, in one Earth year, does each planet go retrograde once a year or more? That's a great question. So again, planets, I wrote a college paper on this in which I referred to the planets being the devil in the system. So the stars come back at the same time every year. The motions of the sun and the moon are totally predictable, but planets, because they orbit at their own speeds, they are on a totally different cycle. So next year, you won't see Jupiter and Saturn and Mars, as I showed you this year, together in the skies. We saw back in March of 2020. And some planets, like the planet Mercury, go retrograde several times during the year. And that's one reason why the retrograde thing is so popular with Mercury as a sign of bad luck or whatever, is that if you say, oh, I didn't tell my colleague the correct information today, Mercury must be in retrograde. Well, Mercury is in retrograde a lot, so it's likely that it might line up with your observation. But planets go in retrograde at different times. For the outer planets, it's when we catch up with them and pass them as the Earth zips around on a faster track that causes retrograde. So yeah, it is really funny that planets come back and are not in the same cycle. They move on a totally different cycle and don't come back. So I showed you where Mars is this year, tonight, coming up at midnight. It'll be in a totally different place a year from now. So Chris is wondering, when did scientists discover there was a wobble? That was discovered probably a couple of thousand years ago. And looking over ancient star charts, it became very clear that the alignment of the sun and the stars behind the sun were changing very slowly. So a couple of things that they discovered, although it wasn't really fully figured out to the Renaissance, the wobble of the Earth, and the fact that stars actually do move in proper motion. But stars are so incredibly far away that it takes a long time to notice there's any change. So Orion that we see tonight is pretty much the same constellation the Babylonians saw 3,000 years ago. But they were able to figure out by the Renaissance that some stars were moving a tiny bit in their own independent motion. Looking through a few comments here. And so as we're coming towards the end, I wanted to mention the next two shows in our series to let you know we're going to be doing, and we'll be back doing science fiction, science fact for our show next Thursday. And then the last Thursday in September, we'll be talking about the September skies. And the September skies are going to be really great this year. Again, planets are on their own cycles, but as luck will have it, we'll have 4 amazing planets blazing away in September. We got Jupiter, Saturn, we got Mars, and we got Venus. Everyone but Mercury will be joining the party. So Christina is wondering, do you think that Kepler and all the early scientists who believed in astrology would still believe in it? So Kepler was just really trying to understand how the universe worked, and he came up with different models that were still look like sort of astrological models. I think they would eventually, with Galileo, it took a long time to let any former beliefs go. They were taught in this way of looking at the universe, which in some ways is a very appealing way to imagine the Earth as the center of all creation and everything going around it. and having, and the term they used back then was called natural magic. This connection between the Earth and the cosmos was very appealing. And even to give up the idea that the sun did not orbit the Earth was a major leap of faith and kind of a leaving behind of old thoughts. And it took Galileo a long time to realize, to accept the fact that the Earth had to be moving around the sun. So it is interesting because old beliefs bring certain things with them, but as the evidence piles up in the kind of way that Galileo was doing science, he realized the only way to explain this backward motion of the planets is that we on Earth have to be moving around the sun, and we can't be the center of creation. Yeah, they've done some interesting tests on astrology where they actually did try to predict different events or monitor folks like twins, for example, to see how they came out as an argument for or against astrology. So if you just search astrology scientific experiments, there's some really interesting ideas of trying to figure out if you see any similarity or difference between folks born at the same time. I guess twins is the best example of that. So we are here in Jersey City. I live over here in Union City, just up the road. And again, we're going to be opening up our dome with our planetarium in just a couple of weeks. So again, thank you all for joining us. If again you want to support us, there's that donate button there. And I do hope that someday I can see a lot of you at our planetarium right there in Jersey City with our planned opening for the general public on the Saturday of Labor Day weekend. Preeti's also didn't astrology and astronomy start in India? Preeti, there's also a very strong tradition of astrology in India as well, and that also may have then informed astrology in the Middle East as well, because extremely important tradition in India as well for astrology. Here's Alicia's wondering, is there a moon for every planet? And the answer is no. Yes, some planets, I'm afraid, don't get moons. The two nearest the sun, so Mercury and Venus, are totally moonless. We get one, our own moon. Mars has two, and then it goes haywire with the 79 moons of Jupiter and 82 moons of Saturn. But near the sun, with the sun maybe stripping away anything that wanted to be a moon of Mercury or Venus, they're completely moonless. All right, with that, we'll end our show. So thank you again for joining us. Thank you for supporting us. And we'll be back here next week for Andrew's presentation on science fiction and science fact. Thank you again, everyone.